I think we're live. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Darien Sturges, and I'm with UC Berkeley at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. And this is the next session in our monthly conversation series looking at the future of oil and gas in California, where we try to bring on experts and surface a wide range of perspectives and viewpoints. I also want to make sure to thank the Clean Break Fund for making this possible. Today, we're going to be talking about the oil and gas industry and specifically about what the industry is doing to decarbonize and address climate change. We want to get a better sense of what's happening inside the industry to accelerate the transition. So today, we're very happy to have two accomplished guests who are at the center of this. First, Chris Gould is the Chief Sustainability Officer at California Resource Corporation, or CRC, which is the largest oil producer in California. And Debbie Gordon is a Senior Principal at the NGO RMI, where she leads the Oil and Gas Solutions Initiative. I also wanted to mention that there's going to be a link in the chat or somewhere in the webinar for Q&A, which we'll take at the end of this conversation. But first off, Debbie, Chris, thanks to you both for being here.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Chris, I want to start with you because you said something that was very interesting when we were chatting earlier. So, California has a stated goal of fully decarbonizing and transitioning away from fossil fuels by 2045. You are fully on board with that, correct? And you made a comment that what you want to do is be the last barrel standing. So, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Darian. And yes, that is correct. Why we're on board with that is because we have modeled our business plan as as you mentioned, the largest oil and gas producer in the state. We like to say responsible production because as Debbie's here, our MIQ certification, our carbon management business, our active injection of the first CCS reservoir for permanent CO2 sequestration in the state. All of those things contribute to what we refer to in our goal as responsible net zero, as responsible production. And that plan to decarbonize, well, it's our emissions, is also has the capability to lower our products' carbon intensity, our oil and gas, for California consumers. As you know, we're a California only company. We are a product of California policy and regulations. And we have married that with the long-term CARB scoping plan for carbon neutrality by 2045. And we support that. And what we mean by the last barrel standing in California is with that context that we are a pure California company, is that when you look at the CARB scoping plan, which was built in 2022, that pathway to carbon neutrality, and you add up all the fossil fuel demand for the transportation markets, non-transportation market, there's still significant demand for crude past into and through 2045, approximately 260,000 barrels per day, or almost 100 million barrels per year. So that is over the current production level of CRC alone, even though we're the largest oil and gas producer in the state. And so it begs the question, well, where does the rest of the oil come from? Today, 60% of the crude in California is imported from foreign countries, Iraq, Ecuador, Saudi Arabia, etc., meaning less than 23% of the crude oil that is consumed, California consumes, is produced in state, compared to the 80s when it was over 80%. And what you see here is that while the state has made tremendous progress in decreasing demand for transportation fuels with the penetration of EVs and public transportation and all those things that, as you mentioned, we support as a company, there is still obviously demand today, and there will continue to be demand through the carbon neutrality goal. So what's happened is we've decreased domestic, meaning California production, significantly faster than we've decreased California demand. And that is, in essence, what the last barrel standing, earning the right through responsible production by having the lowest carbon intensity and by adhering to the values that are common and upheld for California, things like high paying living wages. So we have significantly higher wage than the average California employee in many of the jobs that we have, as well as a lower cost to produce because we don't have to transport crude from around the world to import it into California, and therefore we also save the emissions associated with that. So it's very much an earned. It's not a right. I'm not suggesting that we have the right to that. What I'm doing is simply looking at California's own plan, the carb scoping plan, and determining that we need to, and we are earning the right to be that last barrel produced and consumed.
Thanks, Chris. Debbie, can you share your background and then talk about the work that you're doing at RMI?
Sure. So I'm a bit of a product of California, actually. I am a chemical engineer, and my first job out of undergrad was with Chevron in California. So I worked for 5 years as a production engineer, permitted and worked on a lot of different projects there, both in the valley and also on the coast. After that experience, now this was interestingly right after the Iranian Revolution. So we're a little bit back to the future on a lot of these questions that are coming up once again with what's going on in Iran and energy security around the world and the price of oil and gas. But I went back to grad school because I was way more interested after that experience in California. For Chevron, I was really interested in the policy questions that, Darien, I know you're very much, zeroing in on and questioning yourself about. And so I went back to the Goldman School of Public Policy at Berkeley. And when I got out, I decided I was going to flip a little bit. And I opened up an office for the Union of Concerned Scientists, the West Coast office in Berkeley, and worked there for another decade, working on transportation policy, more on the use of oil and gas. I had worked on the production before and then shifted more to the end uses of oil and gas. So thinking about the whole supply chain and then have since worked in academia. I teach at Brown now. I had come to RMI the 10 years before as the director of the Energy and Climate Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I developed what we'll talk about a little bit later, this tool called the Oil Climate Index that compares different barrels and shows how diverse the barrels are in terms of their emissions intensities, both in California and around the world. And then I've been the last 6 years at RMI running this oil and gas solutions initiative, where we think about all aspects of how do you, well, RMI is very much involved in this clean energy transition. And my program within RMI is really focused on the very near term of what that means for oil and gas, because we're not transitioning off of oil and gas tomorrow. So there's a lot that we have to do. And Chris was talking to some of that, a lot that we have to do to decarbonize this sector. And there are a lot of opportunities here. The problem is there's no silver bullet. So there's a lot of 2% solutions that have to be very strategically knit together to make this a much different industry today than it had been at its
Mhm.
incarnation 135 years ago. I mean, California's oil harkens back to the late 1800s. So it's a very old, mature industry that we're trying to change
Mhm.
as we go.
Yeah. Chris, so I want to dig in a bit on the relationship between energy and climate. So what exactly do we mean by carbon intensity? How important is it? How do we measure it? And how does that relate to climate?
Yeah. Um, well, so we look, as you know, we report our carbon emissions from production of oil and gas in the state to CARB as part of the
Mhm.
California inventory every year. We have that third party verified, and it essentially is the summation of all the emissions um, required to produce the oil and gas in the state divided by the barrels or MCF of natural gas, or both if it's a combined field. There's a whole protocol around how CARB does that. And what you'll notice in that is that when you look across fields, the tables that show carbon intensity, not just for California, as Debbie mentioned, but worldwide, a significant diversity of carbon intensities, right? It's not that combustion of oil is essentially the same, right? That's the scope 3 emissions, but the scope 1 and 2 emissions for production can significantly different field to field, not just in California, but across the world. And that's a function of geology. So how difficult is it for the oil to be produced? So in CRC's case, we have many fields, the majority of our fields, in fact, are require relatively low amounts of energy to produce. Therefore, their carbon intensity is lower than the CARB average. CARB publishes every year an average of, I think this year it's 14.5 grams per megajoule. So grams of CO2 per megajoule per unit of energy. It's all converted into a common currency, if you will, like that. And many of our fields, including, for instance, Elk Hills out in near Bakersfield, is significantly lower than the CARB average. So the average is for every barrel that comes in all over the world, in California, both all put together. When you add it all up and divide it by the whole amount of barrels, you get, I think the number is 14.5, if I'm not mistaken, most recently. So the geology matters. So if it's difficult to extract the oil, you have to put a lot of energy into doing it. In the absence of carbon capture and sequestration on that process, it's going to be high intensity. If it's relatively easy to get out of the ground, it's going to be very low carbon intensity. So for CRC, just to level set everybody, being the largest oil and gas producer in the state, the average across all of our fields is lower than the CARB average of all of the oil, both California and worldwide, that comes in. And we have a goal to reduce it by 20% more by 2035. So that's where you can really lean into the production in California being less emissions than importing it. And in fact, there are ways to make a negative barrel of oil as well. If you put carbon capture and sequestration on the production, you can actually drive that CI not only to zero, but ultimately negative, because you can sequester more CO2 in the production process than you emit in that production process.
I want to get into that in a few minutes, but I want to ask Debbie a related question, which is how important is methane to climate change? How do you measure that, and what's its relationship to climate?
Yeah, and just before Darien that, I just wanted to respond to Chris, and we will put our minds together and compare numbers and try to get some open numbers. So I just want to say, having had the experience I had producing in California in what is probably some of CRC's now fields, I don't know if you took over Chevron assets, but
No.
the oil in California is unconventional. It's like Venezuela and Canada. It's extremely heavy and carbon, laden, has a lot of carbon in it, tar-like, I would call it. Needs a lot of steam and enhanced recovery to produce it. It's not like it's the opposite of the oil in like Saudi Arabia. It's or Norway. It is like if that's one end of the spectrum, California's is from a geologic perspective very, very different. Has extra carbon in it to refine it. So there's just like a lot of energy that does have to go into like pulling tar, something really thick out of the earth and heating it up and moving it out. So we should definitely talk more about it. And then a lot of California assets, because it's been in production for 135 years, very watery. So you lift like 100 barrels of water for every barrel of oil. Like that just takes a lot of energy to do that. So I think that it does bear the question of what Chris is talking about, of how California measures up to oil around the rest of the world. And it really is different. No two oils are the same. I wrote a book called No Standard Oil. It's about this. It's all about the diversity of oil out there. But I would put California's oil on the more challenging side to deal with. Not to say that can't be dealt with, but that it is harder to deal with it. Methane, however, so this is a carbon issue that
Mm.
California has. It's a very carbon-laden barrel. Methane is not California's challenge as much. Methane is a really big challenge in the gassier fields around the world. Think Algeria, a lot of gas in the oil. Think West Texas, a lot of gas in the oil. These are very light oils typically. Sometimes heavy oils have gas. China has some of those, but California's oil is really a carbon challenge and an energy input challenge. Of course, every producer should not be leaking their gas. So any gas in California's oil, and CRC is certified MIQ as low, the A grade methane. But methane is a little bit easier for California oil to manage. Carbon is much harder for California to manage. Why methane? Your original question. It's a super pollutant. It is a very fast climate actor. A lot of the bad climate weather, heat, fires that we're seeing now, the pressure's on the climate because we've heated it up so quickly. And methane takes that edge off of immediate climate change if you manage it, which is why we've been laser focused on it. Also, gas is mostly methane. Gas is co-emitted. Methane is co-emitted with carcinogens like benzene and toluene and xylene. Hydrogen sulfide, that was a big part of my experience at Chevron. H2S is deadly. It was in the gas and the oil that California produces. Huge challenge for corrosion.
Mm.
Um, so there are a lot of climate, environmental, health and safety challenges with California oil. Its biggest things are carbon, and I would say number one, and hydrogen sulfide, number two.
Okay. Well, Chris, with that, what is CRC's approach to carbon intensity? Give me the kind of the high level um, story of how you can produce a net zero barrel of oil, given that uh, context.
Yeah, but I do want to respond to Debbie, and I guess we'll put our numbers together because it's just so for the record, we don't own any Chevron fields that I'm aware of. So I can't speak for any Chevron carbon intensity or fields whatsoever.
Mhm.
I can speak to my fields. And I think that it is a too broad of a brush statement to say that California oil has a CO2 challenge. Some of the fields have a CO2 challenge, some don't. So, for instance, Elk Hills does not. It is lower than, and it's the majority of our production. And by CARB's double certified carbon intensity, we are orders of magnitude lower than every barrel brought in on average. There are other fields, you're correct, that we own that are higher carbon intensity than the CARB average. We have them, and I'll talk about them in a minute here as it relates to how we can clean them up and produce and take on that carbon challenge. But I just want to make clear that it is not our view that you can categorically say that all fields in California have a quote CO2 problem. I don't think that that is correct. So let me just talk about the ones that do have a CO2 challenge, right? Because they do exist. Um, there's ones that, for instance, require steam, right? To your point, they're heavier. Not all of our oils, not all conventional oil is as heavy as others, depending on how long it's been produced. So there are very large differences inside California about what the energy intensity is to bring it to surface and be used. And in this case, where we have local production that is higher than the CARB average, our what we would like to do is to put carbon capture and sequestration on that energy production, permanently store it in a class 6 reservoir, or use it to produce oil so that we have a net close to net zero barrel of oil, at least negative on the scope 1 and 2 carbon intensity. Unfortunately, the practice of producing oil while storing CO2, which should be a good thing for everybody, if we're producing oil, we have a choice. We can produce it by storing CO2 at the same time and have it be a negative CI scope 1 and 2 barrel, or we cannot do that. Unfortunately, California banned the practice of storing CO2 while producing oil. We think that is a very large missed opportunity given that we have to produce oil in the state for refining purposes anyway. So while we need it for transportation, while we need it for our refineries, we should be storing CO2 while we're producing it, which will have the effect without question of having the lowest CI barrel in the state of California, barring any. For instance, I am not aware of any CCS, carbon capture and sequestration projects on Iraqi oil or anywhere else in the Middle East where they're trying to store CO2 while producing oil. Yet we have made the choice in California to import oil that is higher CI in many instances and that does not practice carbon management and store CO2 while it's being produced.
Jumping off from there, Debbie, I know you speak to oil and gas companies around the world. I think you just got back from London Climate Week, if I'm not mistaken. Does that strategy track with what you're hearing from other companies?
So it's very varied because what Chris said is very true that your resources are your own challenge, and every company has different oil and gas resources. Some gravitate towards similar resources, but still there's a large variety, especially in the European majors, because they're invested all over the world. They're not producing in Europe. Europe doesn't have that much other than Norway or the North Sea much production, but Total or Shell or any, they're involved all over the world. So they have a lot of different challenges. For some, it is gas leakage, methane, venting, flaring. That is a huge challenge that some are really addressing. For others, Canada, think, we're going back into Venezuela. I guess Shell is going back in now offshore. It's going to be more likely dealing with heavier oils. So it depends on what your resources are in terms of what your strategy is. A lot are talking about CCS. It's not been really Oxy has more than most in the US, but it's not been hugely commercially successful in large amounts yet. The one thing I wanted to raise to Chris that has come up with Oman and California used to do it for these heavy oils was using concentrated solar for the steam. And we've modeled that. That's been a huge benefit to extra heavy oil is not using gas, natural gas. So when you use gas, someone else has to produce and it's probably leaking somewhere along the supply chain. So, you're importing or using high intensity gas to generate steam, which is the energy that liquefy or somewhat loosen this oil to be able to be pumped. Concentrated solar is a great way to do that. It was being done in Midway Sunset in California in the San Joaquin Valley. I don't think that project continued. It would be great to get that. The other thing that's talked about a lot as I travel around is electrifying everything in the oil patch. So the industry started like a century ago by using its own product. So diesel and gas and sometimes petcoke are the workhorses of this industry. Those are the energy sources to pump and to heat and to extract oil and gas. But the word on the street, definitely happening all over Texas, is that we need to electrify this because it's crazy in this energy hungry world where there's stuff going on in Iran to use your own product. The other benefit of electrification is it could be renewably generated. So now you've totally reduced your scope one own emissions because you're not using your own product that's carbon intensive that you have to produce and then you're going to use. So that's being talked about quite a bit, which is the electrification of this industry.
Chris, feel free to respond to that, but I also wanted to ask you to talk a bit more, maybe for the folks in the audience who are less familiar with what exactly CCS is. And then the second part of that is I know you guys just turned on California's first CCS facility, and that's part of a broader plan, which I would love for you to talk more about.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I agree with Debbie. I mean, um, there are multiple ways for decreasing the carbon intensity of production of oil and gas in California or anywhere else, right? And you're right, it's very location specific. So Oman and places with abundant sunshine and such like San Joaquin Valley are great candidates for that steam, solar thermal steam instead of natural gas. You're right. There's a project there that had been stood up. I don't believe that is continued. But you're also right that electrification, for instance, our fields right off of Long Beach, the islands that we operate on behalf of the city of Long Beach, are fully electrified. So their emissions they sit right in the port of of Long Beach, where obviously we need to be sensitive of air quality everywhere. They're electrified, right? And we've done that at Elk Hills as well, and it's a programmatic replacement of that source. So we're absolutely not wet. I mean, the reality is California produces very little natural gas. To your point, a lot of it gets imported, and we'd be happy to continue down that, and we are, continuing down that path. But in the end, one of the things that we have available to us is California, to get to your question, Darien, equally effective, I would argue, in terms of carbon intensity, is to the extent we can't electrify everything because clean electrons now are in demand for many different end uses, not just energy production itself, electric vehicles, a broader electrification pathway for California is demands 3 to 4 times the amount of renewables on the grid by 2045 as we have today. Just think about that. It's daunting, right? Just we haven't fully decarbonized the California electric grid, and we have to triple or quadruple it by 2045. So we're sensitive to adding to that burden. We can achieve similar results by capturing the CO2 and storing it. And to your point, we're not really using our own product because we produce very little natural gas. Most of it is imported. So it's not a matter of self-perpetuating a fossil usage because we're not really producing it anyway. What we can do, though, is to the extent that there is carbon intensity, which there is, we can capture and store that CO2 underground in that's the process of carbon capture and sequestration. So there's three components to it. There's a capture unit. It's typically an amine chemical capture where the CO2 bonds with the amine system and captures the CO2. It is then separated from the rest of the emissions. It is compressed all above ground in a facility, and then it is injected miles below ground in a permitted Class 6 reservoir by the EPA, in our case, Region 9 EPA, and permanently stored. And that is the first project, in fact, that we at Carbon TerraVault stood up in May. We injected the first molecules of CO2 for permanent storage into the subsurface at Carbon TerraVault 1 at Elk Hills. It's taking 100,000 tons per annum of emissions and sequestering it below ground permanently, actually from the production of natural gas. That gas goes into our power plant. That power plant goes to charge EVs at night. So we are directly contributing to clean electricity on the grid by lowering that carbon intensity so that when California EV drivers are driving and plugging in at night, and charging their EVs while they sleep. They're not charging from unabated natural gas combined cycles. They're charging from a captured CO2 with a low clean energy.
And what's the potential for scaling that in California? I know it's a big part of the state's decarbonization plan. Do you see enough potential there?
I do. So the carb scoping plan calls for 20 million tons per annum of carbon capture and sequestration by 2030. That's the goal.
Mhm.
That's CARB's goal. That's the state's goal. And 100 million tons per annum by 2045. Just to put that in context, California's current are around 365 million tons per annum. So at scale, you're talking about just shy of a third of California's emissions by the carb scoping plan calls specifically to store CO2 underground. It's a complement to building out renewables, which again has a daunting task of quadrupling supply by 2045. So where does this take place? It takes place on hard to abate sectors that are otherwise very difficult to electrify. Cement plants, power plants that I just mentioned, including our own, but the 20 some gigawatts of power plants that still exist in the state that are needed per the Utility Commission for reliability. And our governor has been quoted as saying, there is no path to carbon neutrality without CCS. So we're at the first project of 100,000 tons per annum. The first reservoir is capable of 1.5 million tons per annum. And in EPA permitting right now, we have approximately 20 million tons per annum. So we have enough to hit the 2030 goal, and we can build more to hit the 2045 goal because California is blessed with a subsurface geology that very few states in the country have, just a handful, count them on one hand, to be able to sequester CO2.
Debbie, what other decarbonization strategies are you hearing about?
Yeah, so I mean, I always think in terms of short, medium, and long term, because you have to keep on revolving this door to keep up with things. On the shortest term, and I wonder if CRC could be part of this, but California is a lot like Europe or Japan or China in the sense that, like Chris said, so much of the oil and gas is imported, especially the gas is imported into the state, both, but the gas is like
It's
all
like
but 80%
90%
is
growth.
it's like 95%,
Mm.
imports, 92% imports. Um, Creating, so right now you do have leading companies like CRC is certified A under MIQ as low methane leakage, low gas
What's
leakage.
MIQ? Just for the
MIQ is it's something that RMI stood up, but it's its own NGO now. It's an independent nonprofit certification
Mhm.
body that will go to the site as they have with the CRC
Mhm.
and actually get their plans, do measurements, assemble all the documentation and the measurements to say you're below a certain threshold and grade you based on how low your gas leakage is.
Your methane
Your
emissions.
methane emissions.
Okay.
So it's hard for California to do anything because they don't really produce much gas. And what
Mhm.
CRC is doing in Elk Hills is great. That's more of a gas enterprise and it's certified grade A. But California could join those like the EU,
Mhm.
states or Japan or South Korea that are all going this way to be a buyer's alliance. So to say we collectively, as a massive buying body in the world, want low methane gas. We want this to happen. We're going to flip because the market takes supply and demand. And you have suppliers like CRC that are leaning in and certifying, but there's more gas today under supply than there is for demanding low methane, low leakage gas. And so I think California as a state could really lean in to that. And I think CRC as a certified entity could actually kind of push that along. That's like an immediate thing. I think Chris might talk about, but I think there's really breakthroughs at the forefront in the maybe now to medium term on
Mhm.
geothermal for heat. So, you're drilling holes in the ground, going for liquids and gas. Well, there's heat reservoirs there too. So the
Mhm.
idea of co-locating a lot of these geothermal aspects with oil and gas could be a way to integrate this industry into be more
Mhm.
combined cycled internally as it
Mhm.
operates. And then in the very long term, I don't know, Chris, if you've heard about this, but Canada went in a few years back, went in on this really interesting research project for these heavier oils. And I see California as a breakthrough place that took in situ conversion of heavy oils using nanotechnology and microbes to actually not produce heavy oil, but to actually produce the gas once you convert it underground using its own principles of heat and pressure already that it has underground. So this whole idea of in situ conversion is something I think has been on for me on that radar for the longer term to think about, can we really do 21st century production? Like stop
Mhm.
drilling, like stop
Yeah.
pumping, stop pulling, like do it differently is something that is in the back of my mind.
Chris, are there any other frontier technologies that CRC is investing in or at least looking at? Direct air capture being one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first off, I agree with Debbie. I mean, there is on all the things she mentioned there, geothermal. We have a public partnership announcement with a next generation geothermal technology provider called Sage, um, that we think's well suited for California's geology. And so we've been exploring that. We have some pilot projects and things like that in our fields around heat recovery, all sorts of ways to kind of optimize around, to your point, Debbie, existing production, existing fields, things like that, right? So very transferable skill set without question, right? I mean, the example being my team at Carbon TerraVault is made up largely 90 some percent of my team is made up of reservoir engineers, geologists, regulatory permitting people who came straight from the oil and gas side of CRC, right? Because it's the same skill set and there translates into the field as well when you're drilling inside the existing oil field for um, for injection of CO2. In fact, we repurposed uh, an oil extraction well into an oil injection well, literally the same well. So, very much agree with you. Repurposing is very much at the heart of what we'd like to do across the field. So, those are all correct. The in situ is also very interesting. We have